APIs are the backbone of modern software, yet building and maintaining them often feels like navigating a maze of outdated docs, inconsistent SDKs, and fragile integrations. Throw in a little bit of AI, MCPs, agents, etc., and it becomes even more cloudy. Speakeasy is changing that, automating SDKs, Terraform providers, and documentation directly from your open API specs. Today I'm speaking with Simon Yu, co-founder and chief operating officer of Speakeasy, to explore how they're redefining API development. This is episode 101 of Great Things with Great Tech with Speakeasy. Hey Simon, welcome to the show, episode 101. Thanks for joining me, and let's get into the world of AI tooling, MCP, agents, and all the great stuff that people are talking about today. A very timely conversation, obviously. But before that, let's get into your background and talk about where you started in IT and how you became to co-found the company Speakeasy.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Anthony. Great to be here. Congratulations on hitting milestone number of episodes. Happy to dig into my background. So I started my career actually in consulting as a management consultant, and then did some investing. I was an investor at a private equity firm that actually invested in tech companies.
Okay.
Having spent a sort of few years doing consulting and investing, kind of got the operational itch. It's consulting and investing, obviously great jobs, but you kind of feel a little bit removed from the day to day, and really wanted to, for myself, see what it was like to build a company, build a product with my own hands. And so I ended up moving out to Silicon Valley, obviously the place to be if you want to work in tech, and found a job out here and have been here ever since, which is kind of shocking. I was supposed to be here for about a year, and
Wow.
It's been 14 now. So
there you go. So yeah, I mean, obviously your accent there, it's British, it's quite proper, it's great. You haven't lost that for 14 years. So yeah, how do you find that? So, obviously, doing what you did in England, you had that itch to come and operationalize yourself and actually start a company, which is great. I think every person who's got that entrepreneurial spirit should try this one time in their life to see what it is and go through the rigors of it. But how did you find the early years? I'm interested, was it everything that you thought it would be, 14 years ago? Clearly something worked for you to be there for 14 years.
yeah, I'm not sure if I'm here because of the weather or because I enjoy the kind of work. Actually, it's not entirely clear.
The weather's easy, right? Yeah, it's not hard to
The
beat
weather's easy.
London weather.
Exactly right. No, but I mean, the early years were tough. The early years were tough because, it is such a huge sea change going from being an investor, being a consultant, where it's just a whole different kind of work, right? And being operational, I started my career as a product manager at a company called VMware. Building products is just such a different mentality. It's such a different style of working, right? Consulting and private equity, it's much more project-based. It's much more outcomes situated, right? And so you're really thinking, how do I do this for the next 4 weeks? And I'm driving towards a particular end goal. Product management can be like that. You're trying to build a product, and there's obviously milestones, but it's much more long running, and just the cast of characters that you have to work with are just completely different to build and launch a product versus investing in a company.
Can I go back a little bit? So VMware.
Yeah.
So what product were you product managing at VMware? Because obviously a lot of people listening would be very familiar with VMware and the product. So what were you product managing?
This takes me way back in the day. This is 14 years ago. I was in the core vSphere product team, and I was responsible for sort of a few V0 products. Principally among those was a utility called, it was essentially a phone home telemetry kind of product, where basically one of the big pain points with vSphere is understanding your entire deployment of vSphere, understanding what sort of issues are occurring in your virtual machines. You'd have these massive corporations with, thousands of VMs, right? How are they provisioned? What issues are happening? How do you make that support proactive rather than reactive? It was sort of like a kind of a, I guess, kind of a novel thing that people were doing back in the days, the sort of idea of proactive support. And so I sort of built the first version of that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's right in the wheelhouse of when I was big into it, right? 2010, 11 was when I was really knee deep in platform engineering and trying to make sure that the vSphere platform was running. And so I was there. That's quite interesting, right? So you were there trying to help the support, which to be fair, even 14 years later, support is a big bugbear and a big issue with a lot of tech companies, right? Because you just can't seem to get it right. So anything that can help that is really interesting. And I wonder whether AI and agents and whatnot can actually help that moving forward. But we might push into that a little bit later on. Right,
Sure, yeah.
right, yeah. But so okay, so VMware, and then you've gotten into a few different companies after that. So what was the sort of genesis of meeting up with Saga, who's the co-founder of Speakeasy, to get that going? We're fast forwarding a little bit, but let's get to that point.
Of course, yeah, definitely. Um, the story of how I met my co-founder Sagar is a very typical Silicon Valley, not typical, but maybe a kind of story that can only exist in Silicon Valley, I think, actually. Um, we were essentially introduced by a friend of mine who works in venture capital. And Sagar was speaking to him about an idea that he had, squinting and sort of 30,000-foot idea of a pain point that he was thinking of working on. And he was looking for a co-founder. And my venture capital friend said, "You just speak to Simon. He's entrepreneurial. He's always enjoyed starting companies. You guys should talk together." And so we met at a coffee shop and sort of had a 2-hour conversation about each other and the idea. Spent a long time getting to know each other, just working together, for a few
That's pretty
months,
cool.
and then sort of ended up founding this company.
Yeah, okay. So that's not it is a very Silicon Valley sort of story in terms of, you're in and around the gravity of venture
The
capitalists
gravity,
and
yeah.
technologists and people that are just into that entrepreneurial spirit like we touched on early on. But it's not that sort of typical start where, there's, I mean, I've spoken to a few of late where they're working inside a particular company, they've developed a tool that's internal, and then they might pivot that tool out into a company, right? Or they might donate it to Apache and then build some enterprise sort of solution around that. That seems to be happening as well. This is more, I guess, a crafted sort of coming together of the company, right? And someone's got the ideas and you've got the operations, you've got the experience. Let's kind of make this thing happen. So what was Saga's idea to start with? What's Speakeasy's sort of core founding principle?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Saga was at a company called LiveRamp, which is a large company involved in sort of the advertising identity kind of space. And he had basically built a framework for internally developing APIs and making them secure, evolving them, publishing them externally, right? Making that developer journey much, much simpler. The basic insight is that APIs are fundamental to how software communicates. Probably people don't realize how fundamental APIs
Yeah.
are, but even things like, you open up an Uber app and you want to order a car, right? Uber has so many services involved in understanding car availability, booking that availability, routing, pricing. That's it just internally. And then externally for the APIs, it's things like calling out the payment processes. But the key insight is that despite how fundamental and critical these APIs are, API producers don't really have a lot of tools available to them to build great APIs.
Mhm.
API consumers struggle with integrating those APIs. And so
Yep.
for this thing that's so critical and ubiquitous and important, the surprising little tooling, I had noticed this because at a previous company, I was a product manager, and one of the things that we had to build for our product was an API, and I just couldn't believe like how hacky the whole thing was. We just like building this thing by hand, and it's just like, wait a second, isn't every developer having this problem? How can this not be a solved problem? And so, I think when I met Saga and we talked about that, that's sort of where the idea came from.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head because a lot of APIs, if I look at in the world I'm in now, we've gone through a bit of a rewrite of our APIs from an old sort of HTML-based format to modern JSON and open API standards, but still, it's troublesome, right? And you still get a lot of our customers, not able to consume them right. A new version or a revision comes in and it breaks a lot of other stuff. So there is historical issues with APIs, as great and as fundamental as they are. They're a pain in the ass for people to play with, right? And to use and integrate. I even remember back when I was working on the platform as a hoster, we would create the manual flow of the product first, hand it over to the developers, and they would then automate it and do their thing. But even working with those APIs back then, it was just a pain, right? And then a major version comes out, breaks it. So is this kind of the fundamental, you know, value prop and reason for being for Speakeasy? And I think from the naming perspective, Speakeasy, it kind of makes sense. But am I wrong or am I right there? Are we just speaking easy together in this world of APIs?
You know, it's so funny because we sort of retconned that description. The true story is that Sargon likes speakeasies, you know, like the bars.
I do too.
I think he doesn't like a good speakeasy. But we definitely retconned the idea that, you know, APIs need to speak easily together. So yeah,
Yeah,
we'll go
I
with
love
that.
the a dual meaning. I love it. No, I mean, it works either way, doesn't it? So yeah, I mean, go to Speakeasy, like the Speakeasy. But yeah, it's kind of makes sense and it fits what you guys are trying to do, right? So
Absolutely.
yes, okay. So in the lead up, how do you validate that idea and what it actually is a company doing? What's your product set? What's the core platform that you're offering?
Yeah, I mean, how did we validate the idea? I mean, I think the North Star has always been, you know, as we discussed, right? How do you make, well, our vision, official company vision is how do you unlock the full potential of APIs, right? And that's always been the North Star. How do you make it easier for API producers, service providers to create better services? How do you make it easier for consumers, either human developers or as we'll talk about, I'm sure, agentic consumers? How do you make it easier for them to consume your API? How we went about validating it is a much more typical Silicon Valley story, right? We probably spent a few months building MVPs and iterating on different ideas, and there was a few different iterations that we went to. But basically, towards the end of our first year, or within the first year of our existence, we settled upon the what is sort of still our flagship product today, which is SDK generation, right? And it's really focusing on what I would say sort of the API consumer journey. How do you make it as simple as possible for an API consumer to integrate with your API and to start using it? You made the point that like APIs haven't really changed that much in the past 20 years, and I think it's absolutely true. The state of the art for many companies today is still give an API consumer an API reference doc, and that's it, right? If you think about Stripe 10 years ago, people were like, Stripe is amazing because they have great API documentation, and that's true. That's
Mm.
true, but that's like such a low bar, right? And so
Yeah.
our thesis is that what you really want is you want, you know, rather than giving all of your API consumers an API reference doc and saying go build it yourselves, and you know, 50 consumers are going to build the integration 50 different ways, and they're going to read the manual incorrectly. What you really want to do is you want to give them a single code library, an SDK, a software development kit,
Yeah.
that basically wraps the API and does the work for them. Your consumers import the library, and then they just call the library and then job done. The API is integrated with.
Yeah, and it is a fantastic North Star. Again, very Silicon Valley sort of term that we're hearing more lately in terms of what the reason for being is. But yeah, and I've used it like we talked earlier that I went and had a look at it because you know effectively feed in the Open API schema, put it in there, and then it's got like a command line. You've got the web UI, and then that quick start guide effectively sucks that in, and then you've got the ability to create the SDK based on you know a couple of different options, which is I think the code language. You know, so I saw all sorts, every kind of major code language that you can imagine for and Terraform, which we'll touch on a bit later on as well. And then the idea is that it does it, interrogates it, creates the SDK, and then spits it out for you to then use in a much more simpler, concise way. That's kind of as I saw it, right? It's kind of simple, but no one's that I've seen has done this before. So I think this is where the value of the company really should come to light.
Absolutely, yeah, that's where we started, you know. So absolutely the idea is to be able to take in an open API specification, a description of your API, and then output documentation, output SDKs, output as well Terraform providers, as you mentioned, and also recently MCP servers, agentic tooling, right? And the idea is absolutely to make your API as easy to integrate with as possible. It's worth noting that, you know, we talk about the journey, the journey we just talked about is really an API producer journey, right? It's you building an API, and you building an API can be a developer internally for another team somewhere else internally at a company, and it can be externally as well, right? It could be, you know, if you're Stripe, for example, and you want to offer great APIs externally, it's that too, right? So how do you offer these internal or external consumers, human developers or agentic consumers, an amazing experience?
Yeah. And I think that if we level set about, I guess, what an API really is, I actually generally think that a lot of people probably don't know that because I know that until I started writing my own sort of APIs, well, actually helped prompt engineering my way into writing APIs. I won't claim to be a developer, like I said, right? I'm a hack, but prompt engineering has opened up the ideas in my head. And then actually seeing what makes an API as a application programming interface. I think a lot of people think it's a little bit of magic and quite complex, but effectively, an API is just it's a function that's exposed to do a thing, and then you can talk to that through a front end or whatever it might be to actually speak easily together, if I can use the pun. So, how would you explain what an API is to someone who asks you, "What are we doing here?"
Well, it's hard to do better than what you just said, to be honest with you, but I'll do
Oh,
my
cool,
best,
thank you. Yeah.
I'll give an example of, a company that I worked at, Flexport, right? Yeah, Flexport, there's all kinds of services internally. Sorry, Flexport is a digital freight forwarder. So what we do is, if you are a e-commerce store in the US, you need to ship goods from China, right? How do you get containers from the port of Shanghai into the port of LAX? And then how do you get it from LAX onto a truck to the destination warehouse? There are all kinds of services internally that we built at Flexport that are involved in that loop. There is, for example, a service that knows the sailing schedules of ocean ships around the world. And there's a service that knows how to create orders from a customer. And there's a service that knows how to process an invoice and like issue a payment request for a customer. All of those services work together through, as you said, APIs. Is how these services communicate. So when a customer presses submit on an order in a web application, it goes to the right service. That service communicates with the next service through an API. And so we said at the beginning how important, how critical APIs are. It is critical because it's how software communicates. It's how teams communicate internally, and it's how you call third-party providers as well.
Yeah, they say software's eating the world and AI is catching up, but APIs, are the main meal, right? They're doing everything at that point.
Yeah.
That is an interesting part, and I think from that perspective, how Speakeasy, creating that. I've lost my train of thought there, but how has Speakeasy created the connection? So how's the SDK come at the end of this particular
Yep.
process?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you think about a typical journey of an API consumer, so we talked about, again, let's take an example of a digital freight forwarder. Different teams will create different services. A team might create a service that exposes the sailing schedules of ships. The state of the art today, as we just talked about, is I've created the API. Maybe here is an API reference doc, and the API reference doc explains what the API does, explains how to call it, and it explains the kind of data that the API returns, right? In the case of the sailing schedules, it would return some kind of object that says on a Monday at a ship will arrive in the port of Shanghai, and then on Tuesday it will be in the port of XYZ, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of like bare minimum sort of API, right? So where do SDKs come in? Well, as I said, like if you're just giving your consumers an API reference doc, you're asking every person who wants to use that service to read the manual, which no one ever does,
Mm-hmm.
understand the manual, understand the return types, understand what the API does. They're all going to forget about things like if the API doesn't respond for whatever reason, right? Latency, traffic, the server's down for a few seconds. They're going to forget about retries. Your API consumer is going to forget how to write authentication correctly. And so basically, you're asking your API consumers, again, whether they're internal developers or whether they're external users of your service, you're asking them to read a manual and think about all of these things. And you're really putting up roadblocks,
Yep.
which is kind of crazy because you want people to use the service. Well, you built it, right? You want people to use the thing that you built.
Yeah, seamless and efficiently, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so where do SDKs come in? SDKs are basically rewriting the integration once and giving your consumers that pre-written code that says, here is how you integrate with the API.
Get it? Yeah.
I've taken care of authentication for you. All the key variables that you need to know, your API key or the OAuth, token exchange, and the retries are already built in. Pagination, right? When the endpoint returns many, many results in different pages of results, I've taken care of that. You've done all the pre-work. So all that a developer needs to do is import the library, and call the right
Understand.
method. And so it's
Yeah.
really dramatically cutting down on the integration. We work with a lot of customers, all kinds of industries, but I'll take fintech as an example. Fintech is a very complicated space. And oftentimes, if you're a bank or a payments provider, the integration journey for an API with just an integration API doc might be weeks or months, and you're jumping on phone calls with
Hmm.
your API consumers trying to talk them through it. Well, SDKs dramatically shorten that because, again, the end user, the end developer, just imports the SDK and then calls the right method to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the point that I had before, which I've just remembered as well, is that
Yeah,
APIs generally in today's world will cost. There's some cost associated with it, whether it be overheads through the code or even the virtual cost of consuming an API. A lot of companies charge for an API, right? It's become a bit of a business outlet. And I guess when you're actually being charged for something, or you are charging for something, you want it to be as efficient as possible. I think that kind of ties into what you just talked about there as well, the efficiency of making sure that you're calling these things in the right way. So number one, you don't blow your budget, or number two, you don't, cause an overload or something in the system which actually renders it useless.
oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, the way we think about the market here is there is a set of companies for whom the API is an important product surface. Stripe is, of course, the poster child. And if the API is an important product surface, you want to make it as easy as possible to integrate with. The
Yeah.
longer someone can't integrate with your API, that's just like time that you can't get revenue, right? And
Mhm.
again, Stripe's the poster child. The reason why Stripe is so successful is because they made it really easy for developers to integrate with. Stripe were not the first payment processor by a long shot, but they were
No.
the first to make it really easy to integrate with. So
Yeah.
absolutely, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of my little side projects was working on with the Stripe integration, trying to get that going. And yeah, to be fair, I didn't find it too difficult to actually, even in my lack of opportunity to actually develop. I was like, yeah, I can do this quite easily. And here's a little function, here's a call. They've defined it, just put it in there, and it should work. And it did. So it is a really good example of that. So what you're
Yeah, I
trying to
think
do is you're trying to bring that sort of
exactly.
mentality and ease of use to the rest of the world.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, finding developers who want to focus on API development experience, who want to build great artifacts like docs, like SDKs for the API, it's not easy, right? If you're Stripe, great, sure, I hire a team, you can hire a team for that. But most companies, 99.9% of companies can't do that, right? And so how do you bring that experience to companies that are offering a public API for which the API developer experience is blocking time to revenue? Internally, how do you bring that same ease of consumption to internal development teams so that, if you're a large company with hundreds of thousands of developers, how do you make it easy for the team in Boston to consume the service that the team in Singapore has created, right?
Mhm.
It's the same problem. They're
Yeah.
facing the same consumption challenges. Yeah, one might not be revenue, one might be more developer productivity, but
Yeah.
you still want to make it easy.
Yeah, and more, we hear this. The Amazon story is built on the fact of departments trying to work together, and this is what creates a product set that they've got today and the services. That's kind of the classic Amazon Web Services story, right? And APIs were core to being able to for different departments to talk to each other. Um, let's segue into the AI conversation and agents, but I want to start by saying so when how much of AI and generative AI and platforms and LLMs are you guys leveraging in the back end to get this happening? Because I'm guessing there's not a group of guys and developers sitting in the background trying to sort of suck it in and kind of spit out
Sure.
the code that after you've imported the open API spec. So what part of AI has enabled you guys to make this a reality?
Such an interesting question. You know, surprising, many people when they first hear about Speakeasy and how fundamentally one of the things that we're doing is we're taking an open API spec and we're generating code, SDKs from the open API spec. One of the first things people assume is, oh, you must be using AI to do that, right?
Hmm.
Um, Funnily enough, we're actually not necessarily using AI just for that or specifically for that. And the reason is that I think everyone is kind of realizing there are certain things that AI is very, very good at, and
Hmm.
certain things that AI is not very good at. And it turns out that if you want to generate this SDK code, which makes it very easy to, which is, idiomatic, so such that a TypeScript SDK looks like TypeScript code and a Java SDK looks like Java code. If you want to make it idiomatic, if you want to make it feature rich so that it has things like authentication and pagination and retries built in, it turns out that AI can't necessarily be relied upon to give exactly the right output that you want every single time. The limitations of AI are kind of well known at this point in time, somewhat well known with hallucinations and so on.
Yeah.
And so we basically have built a deterministic generator, actually.
Okay.
But AI is very good at things like, given an open API specification, which again is a description of the API, oftentimes that open API description may not be enhanced. It may not be very rich. It may not have all the descriptions. It may not have all the examples. The method names in the open API specification may not be very descriptive. And so
Mhm.
AI is very good at looking at that and saying, hey, here are some suggestions. And so one of the areas that we use AI for is that other than SDK generation, we are doing a lot more around like the open API editing experience, the open API evolution experience. And there, AI is heavily involved.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so there are other sort of product features that we use AI for, but yeah, I guess
Yeah.
the bottom answer is like, very targeted sort of use
I
cases
get
where it
it.
makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's right. Yeah, it's so, and that seems pretty smart because there are parts where it's good, it makes sense. There's other parts where you probably can't trust it so much to get the desired quality of the output that you want and what you guys want. Because ultimately, Speakeasy is here to make people's lives a bit easier. But if you're muddying the waters with a little bit of maybe hallucination or whatever it might be, it's not going to work that way. So I
Exactly.
totally get that. So what's really interesting is when, like I said, I kind of played with it over the past couple of days, and you put in the open API spec, and then it's like, okay, let's set up your workflow, and then it goes, what language would you like to generate? And like I'm reading it here because I wanted to get it right. Python, Go, Java, C Sharp, which is interesting, Unity, PHP, Postman, and Ruby. So you got everything covered, and Terraform obviously as well. So just explain that process. So you put in the spec, and then it's like asking you for the language, and then the SDK is created based on what you select effectively, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, um, that's sort of the SDK generation workflow where you give us a spec. Actually, once you give us a spec, we are working on an API, open API editor experience where you'll be able to automatically enhance the specification, as I mentioned. Once that is done, once you're satisfied with the specification, you select the languages, and then our deterministic code gen kicks in. It generates idiomatic, feature-rich SDKs in a number of languages. Um, and there's also a publishing workflow where if you're generating let's just say, TypeScript SDK, that gets published to package managers. And that's just sort of what developers expect. Developers expect their SDKs, their packages to be available in these package managers. So we really handle the full lifecycle, everything from how do you define an API, how do you write about it, how do you describe it in the Open API spec, all the way through to the consumer, the end consumer. How do I consume that API?
Yeah, that's awesome. So, okay, let's move on to MCP. Times, I always say this, but we could talk for hours on this, and it's a great conversation. Really hitting a lot of key points today for a lot of the listeners. Let's talk about AI, generative AI, and MCP specifically, and agent to agent. But let's talk about MCP because you have specifically gotten something in there. And like we talked about, MCP has been around since November, only November, but feels like it's been around forever. It's dominated all the socials and the trends and whatnot. And everyone's, even Veeam is kind of announcing MCP, integrations and whatnot. But what does it mean for you? Like, how are you guys taking that and actually, productizing it in Speakeasy?
Yeah. Would it be helpful actually to talk a little bit about why MCP is important for your listeners
That-
and why that's,
That's
yeah,
that's good. Yeah, yep, yep.
absolutely, yeah. Well, I'd like to give the example of, well, firstly, sorry, AI is obviously extremely powerful, right? Everyone's used ChatGPT and, you can ask it some questions and that's fantastic. And it'll give you some amazing responses. But ChatGPT and Claude and all these other LLMs, they're giving you information that's based upon static data that they were trained on as of a certain date, right? And importantly, they can't take actions on your behalf. If we want AI to sort of take the next leap forward, if we want AI to truly sort of be agents on our behalf and to take actions on our behalf and to find out new information, they have to be able to access APIs, right? I'll give an example of, let's say you want an AI agent to help you book a trip somewhere. I want to ask an agent to book me a trip for my next vacation. Well, the AI is going to need to know the dates when I'm free. So it needs to like plug into my Google Calendar and figure out when I'm free. It needs to query Expedia or Google Flights. It needs to understand what flights are available to which places. It needs to understand the ratings of hotels in the area, right? And then ultimately needs to like book something for me. And all of those things require APIs. And how does an agent talk to an API? That problem is what MCP solves. It's the thing that sits between an API and an agent and allows the agent to communicate in a language that it understands and to take these actions, to query on its behalf. So MCP is incredibly important. And because Speakeasy generates, we understand APIs very well, we understand the API specification, we can generate documentation, we can generate SDKs, we can generate Terraform providers, we can also generate agent tooling, MCP, on behalf of our API customers that makes their API agent accessible.
Yeah, and is that in the same way where you create an MCP server for in Python, Go, Java, all the different sort of languages that exist at the moment, or is it?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
In fact, if you on that list on that little CLI output you're looking at right now, if you were to select TypeScript, what you would find, so we bundled our MCP server generation into the TypeScript SDK just for sort of rapid release. You will find in that TypeScript SDK there's a little source folder, and if you click that folder and if you click that folder, you will find another folder called MCP server, and that basically has for every single one of your API methods, it will have a tool. The language of MCP is tools, and so that is MCP server. You can load that into Claude today, and you can start querying your APIs.
Yeah, might give it a crack later on for sure. Okay, so MCP's ends, and then more lately we've heard agent to agent or A2A. So that's sort of got up a bit. So how is that? Because actually, so last year we were talking, and what you described in terms of LLMs and models being, having parameters and it's kind of set and done, and it doesn't know past a certain date where they wrap it up. And then RAG came into play, and RAG was a good way to talk to APIs, but RAG wasn't a way to, I guess, do what you just said, which is the agent experience, which is to go to multiple different API sources and pull it in together. Or maybe you could have done it with RAG, but it was very much not based on any protocol effectively, right? So I guess where MCP comes into play, and what I've heard is that it's effectively, and how Anthropic actually talk about it, it's a USB standard for this world, right? Which completely makes sense. Then you got agent to agent. So maybe just explain the jump from MCP to agent or the side by side of those two as well, just quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I firstly want to say that I am not like an expert in any of this. I'm not sure who is an expert. Things are moving so fast.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the general idea here is that like MCP opens up the opportunity for agents to talk to your APIs. And what comes next? We actually think that what comes next is building software with agents, and actually how do humans build software with agents, firstly. So there's a whole mountain to climb around like what happens there. And then of course, agent to agent, they will need some way to communicate, some protocols to communicate. And so I think there's a lot of innovation happening here around MCP. I'm not necessarily up to speed with all of it, to be honest with you, but yeah, I think MCP is going to be a really important way that I think there's also a lot of other agentic protocols that are coming up around how agents communicate together. So
yeah. It seems like there might be a little bit of a war, in terms of there's always, whenever this happens in life, beta versus VHS,
Sure.
there's always this sort of protocol war that happens. And I feel like, MCP has taken the lion's share very quickly. It seems like it's going to continue and it's not going to just drop off the face. So it's not going to Betamax itself, basically, if I can say that, to sort of analogize it. But yeah, it's good that everyone is onto it because it does create this world. You had me thinking though, when you talked about that use case, right, about booking the trip and, all the ratings and whatnot, we have to get to a point where as a human, you have to trust implicitly this agent, right? And I think that is going to be the biggest step. Like we're talking kind of futures now and whatnot, but the time is for it. So for me, if I'm going to trust an agent, they're going to say, book me. I'm going to Queenstown with the family in New Zealand in a month. If I'd got the agent to book that today, I'm not sure that I would be completely 100% okay with it, right? So
Sure.
I feel like we're a while away from that, but maybe we're not. And maybe this is the great trajectory that we're heading to, where agent to agent MCP is just going to allow us to go, hey, I want to book something in Queenstown. You know exactly what I want, what I'm looking for, hotels, Airbnbs, my flights. I want to do activity XYZ. Go make it happen. That's kind of where we're going to get the trust level to, right?
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, I guess the point there is that there so much that needs to happen around MCP to make agentic workflows useful. Agentic workflows meaning like an agentic workflow that a human developer describes, or agent to agent sort of workflows as well. Um, MCP and its usage probably is going through a similar, I hate to say, sort of hype cycle as like
Yep.
AI in general,
Always
right?
happens.
Sort
Yeah.
of exactly, yeah. A couple of years ago, everyone was like, AI is going to just take over everything. We're all
Yeah.
going to be out of a job in like about a year, you
Yeah.
know? And MCP, I think, is similar, right? MCP is fantastic. It's obviously, as you said, taking off as a standard, which is probably a good thing. You don't want to see a protracted war in standards necessarily. Um, but yeah, what can it? But fundamentally, it's still so nascent in terms of what it can, in terms of um, it enables a lot of things, but there needs to be a lot of infrastructure built around it. There needs to be a lot of tooling built around it. How do you how do you guard against tool confusion, right? When you give
Yeah.
an agent like hundreds of tools, hundreds of APIs, how does it know which one to pick, which one to use at the right time? How do you guard against hallucinations and so forth? How do you make
Yeah.
the MCPs more rich so that the agent knows how to use it in the best way? All those problems are things that need to be solved. Yeah.
Yeah, security is also very important, right? Like we've already seen potential examples of poisoning within the workflow, the pipeline. So security is going to be pretty big in this. To trust it explicitly end to end, if you're giving an agent your credit card, you want it to be trustworthy the whole way, and security plays a big part of that. So I feel like that's and to be if I can sort of circle it back to what Speakeasy is all about, that's kind of where I see you guys coming into play as well. If you can create something that's consistent, efficient, and secure, that's going to be a big plus for everyone looking to use the platform to get to where they want to be with MCP, with API integration, and with agent to agent.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you've summarized it very well. I think that the future here for Speakeasy isn't simply, hey, we've generated this MCP artifact. There's going to need to be a lot of infrastructure built around the MCP artifact, around security and around solving the problems of like auditing and logging and tool confusion and prompt templating and so forth. And so how do you make the MCPs as useful as possible to your developers? And so we are working on some exciting stuff around making agents and AI easier to embed as part of your API infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah. I think just to finish, we've got a couple of minutes left. I just want to point out that I think for people that are out there that want to use the platform, go ahead like I did, sign up, download it. I'm on a Mac, brew install, bam, it kind of comes up and you're there already. A little bit of authentication. So I would just encourage people to have a play with it. And are you targeting sort of that sort of developer community to start with, or what's your sort of target audience in terms of the use case for the platform at the moment in a 30 seconds or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our target audience are ultimately developers. Our, North Star is making it easier for APIs to be integrated with, right? To unlock the full potential of APIs. So you can just get started for free, hopefully in a very, very short order with an open API spec. Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of, I think what I sort of experience is that it's not going to be sort of straightforward as ways to you're going to have issues with your API spec ourselves, because that's the nature of them. They're quite complex by nature. So you were saying you've got an editor in there to help you actually work through the problems, and you can actually modify the spec to make it not so complex, and then it spits it out. So everything that you're doing is about making things a lot easier along the way. So I love that. So in a minute or so, just give us a bit of a future outlook for Speakeasy. What's happened? I made a joke earlier with you on the pre-show. Like, you can't talk about years ahead. Let's talk about 6 months ahead, because that 6 months is now the new 5 years.
That's about as far as you can, yeah, predict. For the next 6 months, Speakeasy is all about making the tooling better so that the input, open API specification, the description of your API is better. So it's the editor experience, it's using AI there, and it's around the agent tooling stack. How do you make AI easy to use within your internal software? How do you use agents internally and externally as well?
Awesome. Great stuff. Hey, I think the value of Speakeasy has been articulated amazingly. You're hitting all the points. I'm looking forward to seeing where you guys go. Again, next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. You've got some great funding as well. You've got some great backing. So it's good lineage, great work. Thanks for being on episode 101 of Great Things with Great Tech.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Been great talking
Awesome.
to you. All right.
Hey, just as a reminder, thanks for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to highlight companies and technologies shaping our world. Don't forget to follow us on social media at GTwGT Podcast and visit GTwGT.com for more great content and all past episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. Please spread the word, and if you feel like it, drop a review. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Great Things with Great Tech.